Bethan will focus on disabled as a verb and how we can reimagine the purposes of accessibility. So Bethan, I'll stop sharing my screen and you can draw up your slides.
Thank you very much. Right, I'm going to start with a quick introduction before diving into an approach to understanding disability based on disability theory. I'll then speak briefly about intersections with some other aspects of personal identity and circumstance. And I'll conclude with a few suggestions for enhancing our approach to accessibility. I use original woodcuts for all my slide illustrations. This is the only one which, as you might guess, with which I took a little poetic license. This is supposedly me. I'm a graduate student at Swansea University in Wales in the UK. If you have any questions or comments, you can find me as LinguaKelter on Twitter, at my website linguakelter.com, or on email at bytheway@linguakelter.com. And if you'd prefer to follow a version of these slides with fewer color contrasts and plainer fonts, you can find that at linguakelter.com/papers/200923 plain.pdf. That's today's date in 2-digit year-month date format. We're used to thinking of disabled as an adjective. This makes it a characteristic of the individual, something you are or you aren't. Now, instead, I want to think about disabled as a verb, a process that happens to an individual with a particular bodily makeup. And when I say bodily, I'm using the word as broadly as possible, including the way our brain works, how we develop intellectually and neurologically, and so on. If disabled is a verb, this opens up the question, disabled by what or by whom? It also allows us to see that disability is a flexible state. A particular bodily condition may be disabling in one context and neutral or even advantageous in another. I saw a great tweet by an autistic person who pointed out that the early stages of pandemic lockdown were significantly easier on autistic people than on neurotypical people because, as a generalization, we're happier with less exposure to the world at large, and we're less distressed by losing day-to-day human contact. This tweeter went on to suggest that autistic people are disabled by the requirements of daily life only because those requirements are created to suit the neurotypical majority. People with many types of autism are not inherently disabled. We are disabled by social requirements that are not designed with our needs in mind. Now, before I speak further about the definitions of the words disability and impairment, I want to explore a couple of illustrative examples. I think these will help us to contextualize the theoretical approach I'm going to outline. Sign language gloves. These appear regularly in the news, often in the context of grad students in engineering or design departments who win a prize for their innovation. These creations are rarely, if ever, created in concert with deaf people or with sign language linguists, and this leads to some fairly predictable problems. The claims made for such gloves are characteristically broad. Sign language gloves, which translate sign language into speech in real time. And the goal, as we see in this news report, is to let deaf people communicate directly with anyone. So let's look at just a few issues here. Sign languages are all different. You can't translate into sign language any more than you can translate into spoken language. You have to translate into American Sign Language or British Sign Language or Australian Sign Language or one of the many other sign languages. Secondly, sign languages are not just hand gestures. The position of the body, the position of the hands, facial expressions, and so on, all contribute to grammatical and semantic meaning. So all these gloves can do in most cases is speak the finger-spelled alphabet and maybe a small inventory of basic words. Finally, who benefits? Any deaf person wanting to use these has to acquire a pair, pay for maintenance, wear them all the time, and communicate literally letter by letter. Alternatives, such as teaching the local sign language in schools, would be so much more useful, but nobody's offering thousands of dollars in prize money for that. My second example is myopia, or nearsightedness. I'm sure we all know someone who's affected by myopia if we're not affected ourselves. According to the American Supreme Court, myopia is not a disability under the Americans with Disabilities Act because it can be corrected with glasses. Seems reasonable on the face, perhaps, but let's consider some figures. Adults' eyeglasses are not covered by Medicaid in 13 US states, at least in 2018. Around 5 million US adults in 2002 who were at risk of vision loss couldn't afford eyeglasses when they needed them. Globally, around 108 million people had uncorrected distance vision impairment in 2013, and this was the leading cause of moderate and severe vision impairment. The leading cause. I took this screenshot while I was attending a conference earlier this year. This is what I see with my glasses on and my laptop on my knees. And that's what I see when I take off my glasses. Without my glasses, myopia means I can't work in any job requiring computer use. It's not safe for me to walk around on my own, except in a very familiar environment. I can't recognize people. I also get headaches and fatigue. Without glasses, there's no question that I'd be severely disabled by myopia. And yet, most of us don't think of myopia as a disabling condition if we live in a country where there's easy access to eyeglasses and if we're fortunate enough to be able to afford them. So this leads us into problems with legal models of disability. Most of us who create content will need to follow a legal model at some point in order to ensure that what we do is compliant with local laws, such as the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA. But I want to show why this is rarely sufficient to provide truly accessible content. As we've seen from the myopia example, legal definitions are often ambiguous or contradictory. They're also often rigid and conventional. For example, in the United Kingdom, drug dependency disorders are classed as a disability only if the drugs in question were legally prescribed. So the exact same condition caused by precisely the same drugs is not legally protected if the person is judged to have made bad choices that led to that condition, rather than having been unfortunate enough to develop dependency on something that was prescribed. Yet we don't apply this same standard to impairments brought about by, for example, participating in sports like boxing or rugby or football. Legal definitions are, of course, designed for gatekeeping. They control who can access support, which means they control who can ask the state for money. As a result, they're often extremely parsimonious, and they will get away with discriminating against groups with low social status because there's little political pressure to increase support for these groups. Legal definitions are generally unilaterally produced, which is to say that they're rarely produced by disability theorists and activists. Rather, they're produced by jurists and medical professionals. This isn't to say that these groups are unable to produce good definitions. It's that they rarely take the feelings and understandings of disabled people into account when they make these definitions. Although medical assistance can be invaluable, it's also unfortunately the case that medico-legal approaches to disability can be severely lacking, if not directly harmful. There's been much work recently that shows that women, and women of colour in particular, have a much harder time being taken seriously in medical contexts. It takes on average between 8 and 10 years for a diagnosis of endometriosis, a condition that causes severe pain and which can be profoundly disabling, for example. It was largely in reaction to the deficiencies of medico-legal approaches that modern disability theory, beginning largely in the United Kingdom, focused on the contexts that produce disablement. There has also been a group of theories that we can call capability or diversity models, which focus on human diversity, the fact that our bodies vary in many ways and change as we age or as our circumstances change. Impairment in these models is not a characteristic of a separable group of humans, but a state that applies to all of us at different times and in different contexts. Capability models in particular tend to be pragmatic. They ask what's possible for a person in their context, rather than what would ideally be possible for them if they had unlimited resources. Together, these theories have been very helpful to me in teasing out an approach to accessibility that shifts the focus from specific disabled users and their impairments and onto producing content that does not disable, content that is as open as possible to the full range of human diversity. It's the social model that first really formalized the separation of disability from impairment. Impairment is a personal characteristic of the individual's body, an injury, a disorder, illness, functional deficit, or other condition that differs from the expected population norms. Disability is a process that results from impairment in context, and that's why I talk about disabled as a verb. An individual may have an impairment, but they do not have a disability. Disability is a process that happens when they interact with their physical and social environment. And disablement happens when the context and the impairment interact to produce one or more types of harm, such as physical or mental harm, harm to dignity, exclusion, inequality, or denial of rights. So how do we avoid disablement as people who produce content or who create applications? Well, approaches to avoiding disablement initially tended to focus on changing the individual, and this is something that is very tied into medical approaches to disablement. The problem with these approaches is that they don't scale. You can change an individual, and that does absolutely nothing to change things for other individuals who may have that impairment, but for whom certain types of treatment may not be possible, affordable, or appropriate. Changing the individual is to a large extent also an abdication of responsibility. It means that the individual changes in a way that makes it possible for them to interact with society in the way that society has always gone on. Society doesn't have to change, systems don't have to change. There are also disabled activists who feel that changing the individual denigrates disabled identity. For example, there is an insistence sometimes on deaf children having cochlear implants, which some argue is the best way to help deaf people integrate into society, but which numerous deaf people argue doesn't produce anything like normal hearing and also isolates people from, for example, learning sign language, which would help them to integrate with the deaf community. Instead of changing the individual themselves through treatment or therapy, we could change the individual's circumstances. This also doesn't scale, ignores systemic issues, and tends towards idealization. It's something that is often done by small-scale charitable actions. And I'm not in any way saying there's anything wrong with charitable giving, but charities that focus on disablement are often far more keen on things that look good in the press, like sign language gloves, rather than, for example, providing a pair of eyeglasses to the millions of people worldwide who could easily be made not disabled if their myopia were treated. We can change attitudes. Now, this is important, but it has to be more than superficial. And unfortunately, attitude change does tend to be fairly superficial. And it must be accompanied by practical measures. We can change social policy. This also is incredibly important. But as we've seen with the problems we get with legal medical definitions of disability, it has to include disabled people in the conversation, and it has to be enforced. And enforcing social policy on disability has proven to be very difficult. Finally, we can change the environment, and we can do this. As people who create content, we can change small parts of the environment that people have to interact with. The content, the platforms, the applications. We can do this. A summary before we go on. Disablement arises in a variety of ways. Disablement is not a characteristic of individuals. Disablement is best defined by disabled people, although in collaboration with medical professionals where necessary. And we can reduce disablement by ensuring that our outputs do not disable people. I want to take a little detour to talk about intersections, because when we're talking about disabled people, we mustn't forget that we're talking about disabled people. who have numerous other characteristics that may affect their disability. Poverty is massive. Access to medical care, to assistive devices, to safe and secure housing, to food are all affected by poverty. And all these things can make it harder to compensate for disability or can cause disability directly. And of course, they can impact mental health. Sex and gender have massive impacts on disability. Work-related injury, for example, is something that is largely faced far more by men than by women, partly because women have traditionally been kept out of jobs that require hard work or that are dangerous, but also because men tend to be physically stronger and therefore more likely to take on dangerous jobs. Mental health is also a massive problem. It's much harder in many, if not most societies, for men to talk about their mental health. And as a result, men face significant mental health impacts. We've already talked about endometriosis. Menstruation is also something that can be severely disabling and is probably the only kind of pain that people are told just to shut up and ignore and get on with because it's normal. There's nothing actually normal about severe menstrual pain, but an awful lot of women never seek treatment for it because they believe it's normal. Pregnancy, while not an impairment, can cause impairments and can cause significant problems for disabled people, not least because they're often assumed to be incapable of caring for a child or of having a normal pregnancy. And of course, in many countries, women more than men are denied various kinds of autonomy, which can impact on their ability to seek medical care, for example. You might not think of language as something that impacts disability, but think about the difficulty of accessing translation software, for example, if you speak a minority language. Or think about the difficulty of accessing education in sign language if you're deaf. There is, of course, great resource inequality for people who speak minority or minoritized languages, or who use minoritized languages such as sign languages. Where you live, or the culture that your family comes from, or that is dominant in your surroundings, can have a massive impact on disability. Whether you're able to seek medical support varies from country to country. Your security can, of course, vary from country to country. If you're in the middle of a war zone, then not only is it much harder to gain physical security, but you're far more likely to be disabled. Cultural attitudes can make it very difficult to navigate medical care, or even for people to admit that they have certain kinds of conditions, as can religious requirements. And finally, of course, race and ethnicity can make things far more difficult. Disabled people of color will find it far harder often to access medical care. Whether they are represented in discussions of disability equality is often a big problem. Design inclusivity, we a few years ago, I think, saw a hand dryer that wouldn't work if your skin was too dark. Hand dryers, of course, are much more usable for people with many kinds of motor disabilities. But if you're Black, then you might have trouble using them. The impacts of racism can cause massive mental health issues. And there are still medical myths that have been shown to be believed by medical practitioners, such as that people of color are more tolerant of pain than white people are. It's disgusting, but it's true. So let's move on to a few ideas for accessibility. Making the environmental changes that I said we can make. Well, firstly, you can remove barriers. You don't have to have flashing content on your website, perhaps, so don't have it there. It can trigger migraines, it can trigger problems for people with epilepsy. If it doesn't need to be there, just take it away. Increase affordances. So offer different ways of accessing the content. Offer different ways for people to use your app or your website. Make sure that it's keyboard navigable, for example. Offer choices. So don't assume that someone who wants keyboard navigation will always want keyboard navigation. Don't assume that if someone wants audio content, they don't also want visual content. Identify needs. If the house is on fire, don't worry about the color of the curtains. What is most important? What is going to make the most difference to the most people? Start there. Don't make sign language gloves when what you need to be doing is making sure that everyone has a roof over their head. And don't gatekeep. Don't have discussions about what constitutes a disability. Design for inclusivity, design universally, design for the human spectrum of diversity. And most importantly, listen to disabled people and hire disabled people. Have a multitude of disabled voices helping you to make your content. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Bethan. That is a fantastic framing of these issues. I've heard many people talk about these issues, and I really appreciate the way that you have framed this in a way that's both accessible and understandable.
I'm sorry, I realized I stopped screen sharing, but I should probably have continued screen sharing. So there we go.
That's fine. And also great kudos to the notion of, hey, there's a plain text version of this and you can get access to it. That's also great. From a practical perspective, I like the way that you ended with some very, very practical advice for people who are building content and services. Outside of the very basics of, limiting flash and limiting, images and things along those lines, I'm wondering how you might apply that principle to other, kind of discovery services, the traditional Google search box, right? How do we apply some of these things, some of these ideals in the provision of discovery, in the provision of content and services? What are areas that you think are, where can we best direct our efforts?
Well, that's a really good question. And the first thing I think I would say actually is to say you don't actually have to limit things. So if you need to have a whole bunch of images on your site, then go ahead and have images everywhere. Images are great. I love images. But make sure that you offer people who can't view those images some way of understanding what you have there. So some way of understanding your content. Because of course, you can't provide the exact same experience for them, but you can still give them a way to understand what's there. If you have a picture of the Mona Lisa, you can describe it. And depending on what you're trying to do with that picture, you can describe it in different ways. So if it's just there as an image, then just say this is, an image of the Mona Lisa. But if it's a page about Leonardo da Vinci, say this is an image of the Mona Lisa, the most famous painting painted by Leonardo da Vinci. So thinking not about what you can see when you look at that image, but about what you're doing with that image. And that's an approach that I've found incredibly helpful and that I've actually found really enlightening for me when I'm designing content, because it makes me think, what am I doing with this image? Why is this image here? What's the point of it? Should it be exactly where it is? Should I make it larger? Should I choose a different image? When I have to think about explaining to somebody what that image is in a way that gives them an equal experience of that content, then it really makes me justify what I'm doing with the various bits of content on my page. So I think that would be the first thing I would say. Don't limit yourself if you don't need to. Or more to the point, don't limit yourself if there are things that you need, but think about why you need them, and thinking about why you need them will lead you to how you provide alternatives.
Yeah, that's absolutely fantastic. I mean, the thing that frustrates me the most is, when people take the time to include, say, alt text image information about an image, which says this is figure 1.
Yep. Yeah, that kind of thing is phenomenal. But there are some great tutorials online about how to write alt text well,
Yeah.
which are very useful and give what, when you look at it, is really quite obvious advice, but advice that we probably don't think about, because if we are somebody who can perceive visual images, then a lot of what we're taking in is subconscious. We understand why it's there, but having to vocalize that is something else.
Mm-hmm. Interesting comment, a question from one of our participants about what about, particularly in this environment, what about the provision of services on Zoom and similar, web applications? Any thought about how to build inclusivity into those platforms?
Oh goodness, that's a massive thing. And one of the things that has really struck me about the use of Zoom is that it comes back to this question of intersections, and intersections with things that you might not usually think about in any kind of equalities context. But I was involved in a conference a while ago where they couldn't use Zoom as their platform because there were numerous people who wanted to participate who were banned from using Zoom by their work policies. So just from the start, there are problems with various platforms if they aren't able to be used in professional contexts. But I think that one of the problems we have at the moment is letting the perfect be the enemy of the good. But that has to also be balanced against not making people ask for accommodations. And I'm not sure I have an answer for that. I'm not sure that there is yet a platform that really allows everyone to be accommodated without somebody having to say, listen, I understand you're using that platform, but it doesn't provide X and I can't use it. I think all we can do at the moment really is be as flexible as we possibly can and be willing to try new things and be willing to listen to people.
Another comment here, again, thanking you for your articulation about not about us, but not about us without us. Mm-hmm. Question is, do you have any, are there other thought leaders or channels that should be attention should be directed to in this space that you'd recommend?
Tom Shakespeare is one of my favorite theorists, and let me just see if I can draw up his Twitter handle, which is apparently now the name for a Twitter handle. He's one of the fairly early disability theorists, and writes incredibly interestingly on this. I can't find his handle straight off, but I will try and put it in the chat later.
Okay.
And I'll do the same for a few other people who are really fantastic to read on these issues. It's worth looking on Twitter, and it's worth asking on Twitter for anything like this if you're interested in particular areas that you don't know much about. My experience has been that although Twitter can be an unpleasant place if it's not curated, there are some incredibly warm communities on there who are delighted to help out if you're learning about something.
Yes, particularly when it comes to issues around accessibility. It's a very supportive community, shall I say.
Yeah. Oh, there it is. I found him. He's at Tommy Shakes, TOMMYSHAKES. I'm glad there wasn't a Z in there. I didn't have to have the worry of pronouncing it as Z.
Yes. And never mind. Brief distraction. Thank you so much, Bethan. This is such a great presentation. I really appreciate you joining us, particularly given the hour.
Oh, well, thank you so much for the invitation. It's been really lovely to be here.
Great. Thank you so much. You have a good evening.
You too.